Hey guys, I hope you guys have had a good day so far. Today we're going to be discussing question number 12 from section 8, which will be the occipital bone. Okay. Now, before we begin discussing the occipital bone, we first have to establish the fact that the occipital bone has an internal surface and an external surface. Okay. Now, let's visualize the external surface of the occipital bone. If you guys can follow along, I'm using the themes atlas, which looks like this. Okay. And for the themes atlas on page 27, we're going to first look at an infro-posterior view of the occipital bone. Basically, we're looking at the external surface of the occipital bone. Okay. Now, first off, we're going to have our squama of the occipital bone, number 9. And this squama of the occipital bone is basically going to extend posteriorly and superiorly to this big hole we have. And this big hole on the occipital bone is going to be known as the foramen magnum. Now I'm going to explain its significance in a second or two. First off, let's begin looking at the center of this occipital bone, and you're going to find your external occipital protuberance. Now, some of you can palpate that on your head. I personally cannot, but I have friends where I have palpated their external occipital protuberance. Now, above the external occipital protuberance, you have your occipital plane. Extending from your external occipital protuberance, you have your highest nuchal line, which will be used for the attachment of the occipital bellies of the epicranius muscle. Because if you guys remember, the epicranius muscle has 4 bellies, 2 from the frontal bone and 2 from the occipital bone, and specifically the highest nuchal line of the occipital bone. Then you have 24, which will be your superior nuchal line, extending from your external occipital protuberance. And then, between the foramen magnum and the superior nuchal line, you have an inferior nuchal line, okay? And the area between the inferior nuchal line and the superior nuchal line will be used, this area right here, will be used as the attachment for the semispinalis capitis muscle. Okay? Now, going back to the external occipital protuberance, number 21, you have 22, which is basically your external occipital crest extending inferiorly from the external occipital protuberance. Okay? Now, we reach this hole, big hole again, in your occipital bone, which is your foramen magnum. Now, if you can see, if you take a look in, which now technically we are discussing the internal surface of the occipital bone real quickly, I just want to address the fact that you can see this small hole right here, which will be 15. That's going to be your hypoglossal canal. Okay? Now, your hypoglossal canal is going to be used for the transmission of the hypoglossal nerve. Okay? Which will be cranial nerve number 12. Now let's go back and look lateral. Now we're back. Now, guys, we're discussing the external surface of the occipital bone again. Lateral to the foramen magnum, you have your occipital condyles. Okay. Now your occipital condyles are going to be used for the articulation of the atlas. Okay. Now, above that, you guys are going to have your condylar canals, number 14. And the condylar canals will be located in your condylar fossae. And basically, your condylar canals are going to be used for the transmission of veins originating from the sigmoid sinus. Okay? Now, before we officially begin begin discussing the internal surface of the occipital bone, we're going to see number 19, and that's going to be your jugular process. Okay? Now, your jugular process can be seen externally as well as internally. Now, let's take a quick look at your internal surface of the occipital bone. Okay? Now, once again, you have your squama of the occipital bone extending superior and posterior to the foramen magnum. And you have your internal occipital protuberance, which is 29. Okay? Now, what I was going to say is that your internal occipital protuberance lies in this cross-like figure, which is known as your cruciform eminence. And cruciform, they call it cruciform because of the shape of cross. Okay. Now, extending from this cruciform eminence, you have your groove for the superior sagittal sinus, the groove for the transverse sinus, and the groove for the occipital sinus. Okay. Now, we're just going to take a quick look at the margins of the occipital bone. Number 11 is going to be your lambdoid margin, and your lambdoid margin is going to be is going to be the site of attachment for the parietal bone. And basically, lambdoid border is another word for the border of the lambdoid suture. Now, if you look at number 10, okay, number 10 is going to be your mastoid border. Okay, now let's take a look on the other side. On your mastoid border, you're going to have something called your jugular notch of the occipital bone. Now, this jugular notch is going to articulate with the jugular notch of the mastoid part of the temporal bone, which will create the jugular foramen. Okay, and passing through the jugular foramen, you guys are going to have your cranial nerves 9 through 11, and you guys are going to have your posterior meningeal artery, and most importantly, you guys are going to have your sigmoid sinus draining into it. Okay, so once again, passing through the jugular foramen, you're going to have cranial nerves 9 through 11, posterior meningeal artery, and the sigmoid sinus is going to drain into it, as well as the inferior petrosal sinus, if you guys can remember that. And this jugular foramen, let me take a look at the Netter's Atlas. I have it already open. On page 13, if you go to page 13, okay, you guys are going to see you have the jugular foramen, which is right here. And this jugular foramen is going to be used for the drainage of the sigmoid sinus. Now, this will be the internal surface. If you look at the external surface, okay, right here, it's going to become the jugular fossa, okay? And originating from this jugular fossa, you're going to have the internal jugular vein, okay? Let's go back to the themes atlas. Now, going back to the mastoid border of the occipital bone, you have your jugular notch. Now, right here, this groove-like thingy right here, that's going to be your jugular tubercle. Now, your jugular tubercle is apparently supposed to cover your hypoglossal canal, which is right here, okay? And then you have lateral to the jugular notch, you have the jugular process, okay? And your jugular process, just remember that it can be seen internally and externally, okay? And that should sum up the occipital bone. Oh wait, no, there's one more part, sorry. For the occipital bone, wow, this is quite important actually. I forgot to mention this. The foramen magnum, extending anteriorly from the foramen magnum to the spheno-occipital synchondrosis, where the sphenoid bone and the occipital bone, where the sphenoid bone and the occipital bone join together, that part is going to be known as the basilar part of the occipital bone. Now, interior surface of the basilar part of the occipital bone, you see number 6, it's going to kind of extend here, okay? But the internal surface of the basilar part is going to be known as the clavus. Now, under the dura mater on the clavus, you guys can't see the abducens nerve, okay? Now, the last thing you have to say about the basilar part of the occipital bone, you have number 7, which is your pharyngeal tubercle, and that's going to be used for the attachment of the pharyngeal raphe, okay? And guys, that's going to be your occipital bone. So, yeah.